wonder if any of you looked at the title and the notices this morning and thought, is that right? I just wonder, has he done something wrong? Maybe some of you thought, doesn't he mean Cain and Abel? Actually changed the title to Tale of Two Brothers, but when I was asked the title a few weeks ago, because I think most of us here are age where you remember some years ago Jeffrey Archer wrote a very famous book called Cain and Abel, didn't they? Which turned into a mini-series. But the Bible account and the events that take place in Genesis chapter 4, we see Cain killing his brother Abel, but the story does continue. And what follows in the chapter is in fact bookends at the end with the tale, also two brothers, which is Cain and Seth. And I would suggest that Cain and Seth are, from a narrative point of view, the Cain and Abel story is a lot of story and it's important, but from a application, if you like, to use a big word, a theological point of view, the Cain and Seth story is most important because that is what sets the tone, sets the pattern for the human race. It's not too much to say, I believe, it's not too much of a stretch to say that all of us, everybody on this planet in fact, in some sense is like one of those two brothers. So I'd like us, as we do together, do a quick survey through the scriptures and then try and reach some conclusions and applications from it. So if we look at the opening verse in Genesis 4, 1 and 2, it says, Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. And she said, with the help of the Lord I have brought forth a man. Later she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. So in the introduction, if you like, to the chapter, we see that Adam and his wife have marital relationship, and they conceive a child, and that child is born, and he's called Cain. Then in verse 2 it tells us he has another son, and his name was Abel. And we are told that they are the keepers of sheep, and that Cain works the soil. Two basic facts there. So Abel was a shepherd, and Cain was, I suppose, in the modern description you'd say, was an arable farmer. Now there's nothing intrinsically wrong with either of those two occupations. Just then as today, we need farmers because they're the ones who raise food, through which we can feed our families. And animals at that time were not just raised for food, they were also raised in order that their skins, their pelts, could be used for clothing. But after that, the plot thickens, verse 3. 3 and 4, yeah, where it says, in the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of the flock. The Lord looked with favour on Abel and his offering. So these two brothers are both gainfully occupied, if you like, with producing fruit and edible plants and also caring for animals, mainly sheep it would seem. But then a time comes when it's felt that it's appropriate that a sacrifice is given, and we are told that they both bring sacrifices. Cain brings the fruit of the ground, but Abel, it says, brings the firstborn of the flock and the fattest, which probably in the modern idiom you could easily translate that and say is, Abel brought the best that he had to offer. Now it gets really interesting because in the middle of verse 4 we're told that Abel, the Lord accepted Abel's offering, but in the next verse it says this, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favour, so Cain was angry. Notice angry, not remorseful. Cain was angry and his face was downcast. So what's going on here? Does it seem a little bit unfair? They both brought a sacrifice relevant to what they were doing. But usually what most people point out and most Bible teachers agree on is that Cain brought a bloodless sacrifice, whilst Abel brought a blood sacrifice, and that's the key difference. And that is the key difference, and that is true. I believe that is correct. But I also would like to suggest there's something a little bit more going on here. And we turn to help to find an explanation of this in the book of Hebrews. In Hebrews 11, verse 4, it explains it for us in this way. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous. When God spoke well of his offerings, and by faith, Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. That Hebrews 4 is what's called the role of faith. And placing Abel and his actions very much in that as someone faithful to God. Now, interesting, I think in order to exercise faith, you first of all have to believe something that you're told, and in this case, believe something that God tells you to do, but then act upon it. Faith is not just believing, it's actually taking what God says and then acting upon it. So God spoke, and Abel trusted God, and he believed what God said, and he brought the appropriate sacrifice. And Hebrews tells us that because of this, because of his faith action, he was declared righteous. But do you notice that what's going on here is Cain decided to do it another way. Cain thought, I'm going to bring a sacrifice, but I'm not going to do it in the way God prescribed. I'm not going to give up the sacrifice he asked for. I'm going to give up what I want to give up. Now, what's really fascinating to me about this is, does it ever occur to you they were both actually doing something religious? Abel said, I'm going to worship God and bring a sacrifice. Cain said, I'm going to worship God also, but my way. Not God's way. I'm going to decide how I worship God. Verse 6 and 7 continues for us. Then the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. So the Lord asks Cain, why are you angry? And then he warns him with this very almost poetic phrase, sin is crouching at your door. It's almost like sin has a personality, doesn't it? It's like a wild animal, a wild beast with a desire to devour you or to control you, to take over you. So instead of sin controlling you, God is saying you should be in control of your sinful urges and desires. Particularly in this passage in relation to anger. And I think that's very interesting and it's very helpful if you've got an open enough spirit to take this on board. You know, if I was to ask the question, have you ever been angry? It's like asking people, have you ever breathed? Have you ever been angry? Have you ever been angry at someone? Sometimes it's okay to have a righteous anger at a situation, but what about when we really get angry with other people? I believe this tells us, you know, everybody gets angry. But God is saying you are still responsible in how you respond to that anger. You are still responsible to control your anger. I think it's really interesting to note that the initial anger reaction is always almost spontaneous, isn't it? It rises up very suddenly. It can bubble up and break out. But I also believe that God in his grace gives us enough wriggle room that he understands our fallen human nature, and he understands that we may not always be able to control that initial gut anger reaction that we feel, but he still tells us that we are responsible for our actions and what we do when that sense of anger rises up within it, when anger raises its ugly head. And interestingly, the way he couches it, the way he frames the responses, he says, Sin is lying at your door. And that suggests to me that when anger appears, you have the choice of opening that door or sensing it and leaving that door shut and not responding, closing the door on anger. Trust me, friends, if you've got unresolved anger in your heart, you need to deal with it. Because let's take a look at what anger can lead to. Verse 8. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Now Hebrew experts, and if you read the little bit that refer to this in Deuteronomy 22, it tells you in its word that this is absolutely worded in such a way as to categorically indicate that this was a premeditated thing. This was planned. This meeting in the field was prearranged. Think about that for a moment. In anger, he planned and plotted to murder his brother. So instead of listening to the Lord and dealing with his anger, Cain let the anger fester, and it turned into hatred, and it turned into murder. He plotted and planned to commit murder. Sin had just entered the human race through the eating of one piece of forbidden fruit, and within one generation, look what it had escalated to: violence, death, and murder. I think that's deeply significant to understand, because it tells us, basically, sin appears in chapter 3, and by chapter 4, you've got murder, family murder. And that tells me that sin, that anger and sin are so serious that if they're not dealt with, the end result usually leads to violence. Not just violent words, it can lead to violent actions. Or to put it another way, behind all conflict in the world and all violence in the world, there ultimately lies sin. Violence in any culture is always a result of rebellion against God. And it's kind of a result of what's going on here. It's a result of man trying to self-assert himself before God. I believe the Bible teaches that violence in society always results from a rebellion against God and people ultimately demanding to come before God on their own terms. When we start on the road of disobeying God and thinking we can come to Him on our own terms and set the agenda, we end up with things like pride, envy, jealousy, hatred, then violence, and even murder. An old commentary I read in this said this, I think it's a fascinating insight. The first murder in humanity was the outcome of the first church worship service. If you think about it, that's true, because these events were kicked off by supposed believers coming and bringing offerings to the Lord. That's really worth dwelling on for a moment, isn't it? Cain didn't listen to the Lord. He went down the road of jealousy and anger, which then turned to hatred. Hatred turned to violence, and then to murder. So what happens next? Verse 9. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" "I don't know," he replied. "Am I my brother's keeper?" When God approached Adam and Eve about their sin, which we talked about a few weeks ago, do you remember? They tried to rationalize it. They tried to blame shift, to blame it on others, to blame it on other people, even blame it on God. But he didn't actually deny what took place. But Cain here, he blatantly stands before the Lord and he lies, insisting that he doesn't know where his brother was, as if the Lord didn't know. Furthermore, he was defiant, because he asked God if he's his brother's keeper. In other words, he's responding, he's challenging whether God even has the right to question him on it. I think it's worth saying at this point, where the application of this lies is for a family, or even for a nation, to survive, no, to more than survive, to prosper, we must be responsible I've left the scripture up behind me, where we stepped out for a moment. By the way, we don't really know where East of Eden is. What we do know is that Cain didn't seek God's forgiveness, did he? Nor did he seek God's favour. Rather, off he went, and he went his own way, following his own desires with his own sense of direction. The other thing that I think is interesting to note is that these verses tell us he built a city and he named it after his son. So today when we think of a city, we think of London, Paris, New York, and I was just looking at what the definition of a city is in the UK, and it's quite complicated, but generally it's a population of 3,000 or 300,000 or a Dyson cathedral, and there's a few other criteria, but historic local government and stuff like that. But that's not what we're talking about here with the biblical definition of a city. I thought it was interesting to know that the definition of a city at that time was determined whether it had a secure walled-in area. In other words, cities could be small or large. What defined a city was a residential development with a secure boundary, a secure, walled, enclosed area. Now that's important where we just go back a few verses and remember that God said you're going to be a wanderer and a fugitive. And what does he go and do? He goes and builds a city. So he immediately goes out and defies God. And not just in the sense that he didn't accept God's will, but do you notice he didn't even accept God's promise that he would protect him? Otherwise, why build a walled, secluded, secure city enclosed for protection? So again, at the bottom of everything he does is unbelief and disobedience. Now, the verses that follow, there were a whole bunch of relatives whose names sometimes are rather hard to pronounce. And the author mentions those deliberately in order to clarify the continuity of the family line, but passes over them quite quickly in order to get to verse 19, where it says this, verse 19. Lamech married two women, one named Ada and the other Zilpah. Notice anything there, folks? Ladies, please note we have the first bigamist in the Bible. If you go back to chapter 2, verse 4, God said, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, singular, and they should become one flesh. And now here we go, a couple of generations. Lamech, in open defiance and disobedience to God, goes out and marries two wives. Good luck, sir, I might say. So again, the big point is he's in open rebellion to God. We just put up the next few verses from verse 20, and the list continues, and it gives us some very interesting insights into the beginning of the human race. We see contained within that list of names the originator of nomadic farmers, people wandering and farming the land, and then we were told about Cain, who's the first to forge in bronze and iron, and his sister, who is named as a leader of female musicians. And tradition says that she actually made music on drums for the purpose of idol worship. The point here is, and the reason this list is given, is to show that Cain's descendants are gifted, but godless. Then in verse 23 it says this, Lamech said to his wife, Ada and Zilpah, listen to me, wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. So what we see again is more violence. Vengeance is taken, and that grace that God had chosen to show Cain's family line is ignored by his first generation ancestors. All this violence springing up from a single act of disobedience by Cain and worsening within a supposedly cultured civilization. That's interesting, isn't it? Remember, there's now music, there's the work of artisans and artists, musicians and craftsmen. This is a culture where art increases, whilst at the same time society degenerates and falls further and further away from God. That's a familiar pattern, isn't it? The family line of Cain was able to make great achievements and accomplishments, but at the same time they were drifting further and further away from God and degenerating further and further into violence and murder. This is a picture of a society that has artistic and technical success alongside moral failure and sin. Just ringing any bells? Material progression does not mean moral advancement. Don't be confused by those two things, regardless of what the scientists and the sociologists tell you, because that, I believe, is the lesson of the family line of Cain for all of us. But then there's a couple of wonderful verses at the end that tell us this in verse 25 and 26. Adam made love to his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth, saying, God has granted me another child in place of Abel, since Cain killed him. And then Seth also had a son, and he named him Enosh. At the same time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. So in contrast to the family line of Cain, we now see the family line of Seth. And it is a godly line, a line that begins the point of people calling upon the name of the Lord again. Hallelujah. So the conclusion of this tale of two brothers, in spite of what Jeffrey Archer says, it's really about Cain and Seth, not about Cain and Abel. And it tells us that one family line ended up ungodly, and the other called upon the name of the Lord. And this tale of two brothers is the tale and the history of all humanity ever since, in that most end up ungodly, but at the same time, a few remain faithful and call upon the name of the Lord. Humanity may develop materially, it may build great cities, create new things, make beautiful art and music, whilst at the same time morally degenerating.